Hello and welcome to the very first lecture of the module. This is going to be an introduction to studying language. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to know a language. So we talk about I know English, I can speak English. What do we actually mean by that? We're going to then go on to describe levels of linguistic analysis. So as linguists, we identify various levels of what we call the rank scale, and domains beyond that of linguistic study. So we'll look at semantics and pragmatics. We'll then look at the work of an anthropologist from the 1960s called Charles Hockett, who many of you will have come across before, and his theory of design features. So we'll talk about what makes a language a language. In particular, we'll dwell a little bit on the question of whether or not animals have language. We'll differentiate between language acquisition and learning, so what it means to learn a language instructionally versus acquiring it as a first language. So we'll start to draw on our own experiences too, and I hope that this is something we can do throughout this module, both in the seminars and in lectures. That I want to set up a dialogue with you in the lectures, really, that has you reflecting on your own experiences of these things, because this is one very easy way to put into practice the concepts that you come across, so the theories that you will come across as you're reading them. Cross-reference them with your own experience. Does it chime with your own experience? Does your own experience perhaps tell you that these researchers haven't completely thoroughly interrogated the theories that they're putting forward? We'll also look at the work of behaviourists like Skinner, and we will dwell in particular on the school of behaviourist psychology, and in particular the concepts of reinforcement, whether that works as an aid to learning language. If caregivers reinforce positive messages about particular structures, are children more likely to acquire those structures? And I hope by the end of this lecture that you will be able to refute explanations that are based on this behaviourist psychology. So that's quite an ambitious set of outcomes for this lecture. Do by all means pause the lecture, go and have a drink, go and read some papers. So as we go through, there will be links for you to click on. I don't expect you to listen to this entire lecture holistically. That's not the point of a recorded lecture. You may pause it, you may come back to it, you can take notes. You are to listen when instructed to the various clips. And there may be activities that we do throughout the lectures that I will give you. Do stop the video at that point and go and do the reading, do the activity, because our contributions on the forum built for this module will form part of your learning. You will learn to work as a group, as you would do if we were face-to-face, but you will do that online, which is clearly safer. So I do need you, when I ask you to go and have a drink, or go and have a snack, or go and do the reading, or go and look at the links that I'm sending you. Often there will be links to short videos. Let's get started then. What does it mean to know a language? Let's think about that. Let's just think about that for a second. And I won't scroll forward to some of the remarks. What do we have to know in order to know a language? Think about, some of you may have more than one language that you acquired in infancy. So you may be bilingual or trilingual, or what researchers would call plurilingual, having more than one language. That's perfectly possible. Many of us will be monolingual. And we can talk through our own experiences, so I can bore you at this stage with my own experience. I am what we call an L1, that is a first language speaker of English. The English that I acquired in the Midlands of England. And I know the sound system of English. So I know, for example, that if we say something like cup in my dialect, that's perhaps not how all of you would say it, but that's the sound system that I acquired. So when I have a cup of tea, I know others of you may have a cup of tea. Some of you even further up north may have a cup of tea. And if you're speaking American English, it may be a cup of tea. Okay, so there are different phonemes that we can acquire depending on the variety of English, but what is crucial is that we do learn the sound system. We can not only recognize phonemic differences, but we can produce them. If we think in terms of morphology, okay, if we think in terms of what you can do combining sounds in the language to make meaningful larger units, then we need to know how we can combine sounds. So I know, for example, as an L1 English speaker, that it's no longer possible to have the cluster fn in my language. I can't have f followed by the nasal n. But if I'd been living 1,000 years ago in England, then my verb for sneezing would have been fneosan, which is a nice onomatopoeic verb. You can hear it describing the sneeze. And it's changed from fn. Phonotactically, we can't have initially f followed by n. That's blocked. So I need to know how to combine the sounds in my language. And a competent speaker of a language will know that. We need to know what the fixed sequence of sounds is in our language. That means what morphemes can we combine. So I know, for example, that beer garden is a perfectly suitable compound noun in my language. But I also know, having learnt a little bit of French, that not all languages function like that, that there are restrictions on how we combine morphemes. And if I said jardin de bière in French, it would mean a garden literally made of beer. So that's not possible for French speakers, and L1 French speakers will also acquire that knowledge. I need to know what concepts are conventionally represented by the words that I know. So I know, for example, that if I say black bird, and if I put the stress on bird, then it could be any black bird. I could be talking about a crow, or a raven, or any black bird, a black vulture. If I say blackbird, then in British English, and also in American English, I'm talking about a particular species of thrush with a yellow beak and yellow legs that bounces around the garden and eats worms. So I know that if the stress shifts in English on the compound to the first part of the compound, then I'm talking about a particular species of bird. I also know that if I say I live in a green house, then my house might be painted green. But if I live in a greenhouse, that's rather different, and my house that would be rather peculiar, because a greenhouse is made of glass and is used for growing vegetables. So I know about the concepts represented by the words that I know. And this range is what I need to know a language. But as we're going along, you can see the problem. As children, we're not aware of all of this. We have to acquire this as we go along. I know about the grammar of my language, so as an L1 English speaker, I know that the subject usually comes first in a declarative sentence. So, I like cheese. I know that it's not like I cheese. If I was a Welsh speaker, then I might have something that came verb first. Okay? But I'm not. I'm an English speaker, so I know that I have to put the subject first, all things being equal, in a declarative utterance. How does my language allow words to be put together? It might allow me to say cheese, I like, but it will only allow that in English if I'm contrasting it with something else. So if someone said to me, do you like cheese or do you prefer ham? And I would say cheese, I like. That's fine, but it's only acceptable in contrast if I've been offered a choice. It's not an acceptable sentence to just burst into a room and say cheese, I like, on my sandwiches. That would be quite peculiar, and most people would judge that as incorrect. So I know about how to put words together. But just before we move on to what linguistics is, we might want to reflect on this. How does this pan out for people who are learning languages instructionally as second or third or fourth languages? Do they have to know all of this? So we might want to say, when is somebody a competent speaker of a language? And we give leeway to children acquiring their first language, so they may think that a greenhouse is made of green bricks, when in fact we know that it's made of glass. They may think that a blackbird is just a bird that happens to be black, when in fact we know that it's this particular species of thrush with the little yellow beak. And we give leeway to children, but we seem to give socially less leeway to learners. But they also have a lot to learn, and they sometimes produce utterances that are not natural sounding. So they will particularly, learners of English struggle particularly with things like tense. So many languages around the world don't use tense in the same way as English. Many languages in the world don't inflect verbs for past tense in an irregular way. So if we think about things like the wind blows, the wind blew, it would be quite normal for somebody acquiring English to form something like the wind blowed very hard yesterday, by analogy with verbs like snows. It snows, yesterday it snowed. Does that mean that they don't know the language fully? We'll have to think about this as we go on. So what does it mean to know a language? I don't want you ever to stop thinking about that question, really. It's central to our understanding of linguistics and how we acquire and use our language over the lifespan. But we can move on and we can think about what is linguistics. So you're here in this module to study linguistics. Okay, so that's what ET118 is about. But what is linguistics? What's our remit as linguists? People will often say to you, you're a linguist, how many languages do you speak? This is the classic joke. You don't have to speak any other language other than the one you acquired in childhood to be a linguist. It's perfectly possible to be monolingual and study linguistics. But there are levels at which we analyse language. And that's called the rank scale, and we can go up the rank scale. So if we start with phonetics, the tiniest units of sounds, and not even contrastive units of sound. So if we think about something like oil versus lamp, I think in most of the dialects that we have in the class that we're in, for most speakers, there's a difference between the l in oil. So say them to yourselves now. You can pause this video when you're tired of hearing me say oil and lamp. There's a difference between the quality of oil and lamp. And I could reverse those. The first one in oil is what we call the dark oil. And we make it at the back of the mouth. So we raise up the tongue. The rear of the tongue raises up towards the palate and you get O. The light L that we have in lamp, just say lamp and you will hear that your tongue hits the front of your palate. Okay, just in front of the alveolar ridge, that ridge in your mouth. Lamp. But if I reverse these, I just get a rather peculiar effect. If I said lamp, I would probably just sound Russian, like a Russian person who has Russian as L1 and has acquired English as a second language. So lamp is understandable, it's perfectly possible. It just doesn't sound like an L1 speaker's production. I could say oil, and I might just sound Welsh, or perhaps like I'm from the Highlands of Scotland, because Gaelic and Welsh don't treat L in the same way. They have different distinctions between dark and light L. So we have phonetics. We can then move on to phonology, so contrastive sound segments. And I hope I proved to you that those aren't contrastive. They're not two different phonemes. They are what we call allophones, and we'll come on to that in later weeks. They are variants of the same phoneme. And they're constrained. The L turns up at the end of a syllable, and the light L turns up at the start of a syllable in most varieties of English. So phonology, contrastive units. And we instinctively can pick these apart. So we know, for example, that hit and hat are different words. I hit my hat. And we know that I and a must then be different phonemes because they make a meaning difference. If we swap out I for a, we're no longer describing the action of striking something. We're describing something that we wear as a head covering. So we can talk about phonemes and phonology. The way that we put these phonemes together has implications then for meaning. If I stick h, I, t together, I get the action of striking something. If I stick h, o, t together, then I get the state of being warm. So I get hot. Okay, I get the word hot. So we can have morphemes, meaning units. If we then put those meaning units together, we can say entire sentences. So we can say, I hit my hot hat. Okay, and within that sentence, as an English speaker, I can isolate the subject, which is I'm the one doing the hitting. I hit. Okay, well that's a verb, because it's an action, I'm performing an action. And then what am I hitting? Well, I'm hitting some kind of subject there, and the thing that I'm hitting is my hot hat. Within that sequence, I could isolate hot as an adjective, hat as a noun, and my as some kind of pronoun. Okay. So I can talk about syntax, the order in which words appear. And I am blocked in English from saying things like, I hit hot my hat. I can't do that. I can't put the adjective before the pronoun. So there are restrictions on the way in which words can be patterned, and they vary across languages. I can move then up the rank scale to semantics, which has to do with meaning. So it's perfect. It's a perfectly sensible sentence. I hit my hot hat. It's not perhaps a sentence we would say all the time unless our hat was on fire. But there are sentences that semantically can be quite strange. So there's this very famous sentence that we always get quoted from Chomsky, who said, colourless green ideas sleep furiously. Okay, he says colourless green ideas sleep furiously is a perfectly adequate sentence syntactically, but all L1 speakers of English would agree that it's somewhat peculiar semantically. Something can't be colourless and green. That's a clash. We can't have colourless green ideas. Okay, ideas don't sleep because they're not animate. And you can't sleep furiously anyway. We can't modify the verb to sleep with an adverb like furiously. It sounds peculiar. We could sleep deeply or soundly, but we can't really sleep furiously. So we think about semantics and meaning. We think about meanings that can't go together, meanings that are blocked or strange or don't sound L1. We also think about pragmatics. So if we think about speakers of English, if I come into a room and the window is open, it's rather cold, and you happen to be sitting close to the window, and I look at you and I say, it's cold in here. I might be saying on the surface, I am telling you that it's cold in here, but if I glance at the window and then at you, and I say it's cold in here, especially in the context of me being your lecturer and you being in the seminar room, it's likely that I'm saying to you, obliquely, please could you shut the window? So pragmatics, what words actually do when we use them in context. And we can take it one step further and talk about discourse analysis. And we can go on to look at stretches of discourse and how they influence people. So if I said that to somebody who was particularly obstructive and didn't like me, they might want to not help me. And they might say, yes, it is cold, isn't it? I like it when it's cold. And they might be deliberately ignoring my inference. So we can look at discourse analysis, how speakers engage with one another, how they get tasks done, how they might want to be cooperative, how they might want to not be cooperative in discourse, in a stretch of talk between one or more people. And you can look at this link that we've left on the slides, which is the benchmark statement issued by the Qualifications Authority for English universities. It will tell you a little bit more about what you can expect to cover in a linguistics degree. And it will be broadly these levels of linguistic analysis that I've outlined to you. And indeed we'll be covering most of these, bar the last one, in this module. Okay. Just going through this again then. There's a very lengthy description of phonetics, and I hope I've outlined to you clearly what phonetics is, but just to make it clear, it's a study of the physical properties of speech sounds. So where do we make speech from? We'll be going through this in this module. The idea that the lungs produce air, there are kind of bellows, the air is forced out of the lungs in most speech sounds, although we will come across speech sounds that aren't. Most speech sounds are produced egressively, so air comes out of the lungs and through the speech channel. Okay? And of the articulatory, that is the things that we move, making speech. So we've already seen that we move our tongue when we did the oil and the lips example. We've seen that we move our tongue within the mouth. And the psychological mechanisms that we use to produce speech. So as I'm talking to you, somewhere in my brain I know what I'm going to say and I'm priming my words to come out. I'm actually multitasking very hard giving this lecture because I'm reading the slides on the screen. I'm thinking about what I want to say to you. I'm thinking whether I'm going to make any slips of the tongue. I might trip up and say the wrong word. And indeed we'll come on in later modules to looking at why we make these slips of the tongue. Why we say things like, he's gone to Germany on biscuits. And it might be because we're on the phone to somebody and we can see a packet of biscuits. And the start of bi is the same in biscuits and business. So we might say he's gone to Germany on biscuits because we're looking at the packet of biscuits. Okay. Phoneticians also concern themselves with transcribing the world's languages, so writing down what they sound like. And we'll learn to do that in this module. You will learn to transcribe phonetically. Some of you will have had dealings with phonetic transcription already, and we'll practice that and really get good at it. Yeah. And we've talked about phonology, that is the systematic organisation of speech sounds in a particular language. So across languages, the things that make a meaning difference are not always the same. We've seen that there are, in our language, it doesn't matter whether the quality of l is or l. We still recognise it as some kind of l. But there might be languages where they are two separate phonemes. There will be languages where there are very few. If you think about front vowels like I and E, there are languages that only have one front vowel. So some languages in North America are restricted to only having one front vowel. We have quite a few front vowels, and we'll come on to how many we have in English when we get on to phonology and we get on to studying it. Okay? But a student specialising in phonology is expected to display understanding of theoretical approaches to the analysis of sound systems, and we will be able to do that by the end of this module. We'll also look more closely at morphology, and we'll be focusing on English, but we will also be looking across the world languages. And please, I do urge you, if you speak another language, and I'm talking about even if you did a GCSE in French, and it was some time ago, you might even speak a conlang. I don't know who can speak Klingon, I don't know who can speak Dothraki, but it doesn't matter. All of these languages are very good for us. If any of you speak BSL, British Sign Language, you can think about how morphology works in terms of hand shapes. So hand shapes make the difference in sign languages. Sometimes orientation, whether your hands are facing towards your body or towards the speaker, will make a meaning difference. You can start to think about morphology, smallest meaning units. Okay, so we need to understand theoretical approaches to morphology. And we will be able to do that. By the end of your degree, you will have control of that. And you need to be able to understand how morphology interacts with syntax. So and phonology, if we look at something like incredible, and we compare it to something like impossible, by the end of our seminars this term, we should have started to think about the fact that in fact they're one morpheme, the im in impossible and the in incredible, but they are conditioned to turn up differently because of the sounds that follow them. Really, we're looking at the morpheme in, which means opposite of, so not possible, not credible, not believable. But because the p is there, it's not impossible, but it becomes impossible with a m. What will we learn about syntax in this module then? Well, we will learn how words are combined in English to form phrases and then to form larger utterances. We'll look at the relationships between the different parts of the phrases. And we will try to find systematic patterns across the world languages. So this is something that concerns syntactic theoreticians a lot. What do all world languages have in common? And we will find out that, in fact, nouns and verbs seem to be pretty robust categories, and that certain patterns of word order turn up across the world's languages, some of which are more prevalent than others. So we call ours SVO. Okay, so it's a subject-verb-object language. Something like Welsh or Irish would be VSO. There are also languages that have the object first. So if we were going to say something like I like cheese, those languages would say cheese like I. And we will look at these different patterns. Syntactic theory seeks to understand the theoretical basis for the evidence that we find. Why is it that some languages put the subject first? Why is it that some languages put the object first? What is it possible to say in the world's languages? And are there structures that never occur? Are there structures that are common to all the world's languages? So a competent linguist who specialises in syntax has to understand these theoretical approaches to syntax, and indeed we'll begin to discuss those today, happily. So you can start thinking about how we approach syntax, how we talk about syntax. Semantics then, the study of meaning. We talked about this. Lexical semantics looks at the meaning of words. So we might compare, for example, pairs like master and mistress, and some of you who've looked at language and gender might have done this already. So if we look at language, sex and gender, the way that femaleness is encoded in English, it sometimes leads to what's called pejoration. That is, the female part of a pair of words sometimes suffers in meaning so that it means something bad. If you think about master and you compare it to mistress, those of you who are L1 speakers, and many of you who are L2 speakers, will be aware that a mistress is often used to refer to somebody who's having an extramarital affair. Okay? The status of the woman actually doesn't matter, but it's a woman who's having an extramarital affair with somebody who is married. Okay? And you become somebody's mistress. And that has bad overtones. And I could find you lots and lots of these pairs. If we look at bachelor and we compare it to spinster, we will see that spinster is not a particularly flattering epithet. So spinster tends to have connotations of being elderly, perhaps somebody who keeps lots of cats, whereas bachelor tends to equate to an unmarried man who maybe enjoys a lot of female company and has a lot of freedom, maybe has a powerful car and a nice flat, interesting job. Bachelor tends to have positive connotations, tends, I say tends, and spinster tends to have negative connotations. So we will look at this. We will look at lexical semantics. And a student who specialises in semantics will understand these basic concepts of analysis, but also be able to critique semantic theories. Pragmatics, then, looks at the way we actually deploy linguistic resources. So we could take this on and we could talk about bachelor, and what we see is that in fact the speech community that has noticed this differential between bachelor and spinster has come up with a third term. So we sometimes hear talk of bachelorettes now, and we might want to think about what that word means, how it's deployed. Is it an attempt to reclaim bachelorhood for female people? So is it so that female people can have some of these attractive tendencies linked to not being married, which tend to pattern in being young, having lots of exciting fun, perhaps having, actually sometimes it means having lots of premarital sex, having an exciting sex life, right? We might want to think about bachelorette, and you can have a look for bachelorette and see how it patterns. How does it actually get used in speech and in texts? So pragmatics concerns itself with how language is used, and remember that speech communities use language. Language isn't an independent entity. It depends entirely on its speakers. Language is dead until it's spoken. How is language used to enable a speaker to relate to and understand and maybe influence other people? So if I use the word bachelorette to my friends, they might like that word. They might really enjoy using that word with me, but I might be wary using it with people whose belief systems I'm not sure of. I might not want to use that. So if I talk to somebody who's 70 and has never been married, I don't think I would say, you know, are you a bachelorette? I might think twice about that because it's not very polite to ask people about their marital status. So we'll think about the kinds of utterances that get said, that don't get said, how we might change what we're saying depending on who we're speaking to, how we might change what we're saying depending on the situation. And a student who goes on to specialise in pragmatics, again, will be able to compare and contrast different theories of pragmatics. So there are plenty of theories circulating about pragmatics. There are theories that say that speakers seek to be cooperative. There are theories that disagree with this and say that speakers don't seek to be cooperative. They seek to accomplish their own ends. They want to get what they want out of a conversation. We'll be able to contrast and compare those. And if you go on to study discourse analysis, then you will see that it has to do with the way language is used in context. Okay, how do we organise our language when we're talking with ourselves? So we can have discourse with ourselves. We can have discourses which are addressed to an audience. So they're monologues, if you like, if you think of Hamlet's soliloquy or perhaps political speeches. And we can conceptualise this at various levels. So some people look at written discourse, some people look at spoken discourse, some people look at discourse across entire websites. So they might look at the comment section of The Guardian, for example, and look at how people construct their own identities through the kinds of conversations that they have in Guardian comment sites. Yeah? But again, there's a wealth of theories circulating about discourse analysis, about how different speaker groups might use discourse. There are theories concerning men and women speaking differently, people from different social classes speaking differently. In India, for example, there are theories about caste and how that influences the kinds of words and speech that we use and how we talk to each other. If we look at Japan, the Japanese language traditionally has a complex system of honorifics. That is, there are systems for addressing people of different social rank, and there are theories that address why that might have come about. And you would have a good understanding of those different theories and be able to argue for and against them being more or less correct. Once we've come across these key concepts, we can expand outwards and we can see that there are different domains of linguistic study. So in addition to what we call theoretical linguistics, which is very abstract linguistics, where we just look at examples taken out of context, we might engage in sociolinguistics. So that's looking at language as it relates to different societal factors. And that would include things like social class, sex, gender, caste, perhaps even location in the world. So sociolinguistics would take into account, for example, Hong Kong English versus American English versus Australian English. And these will cross over with each other, these different subfields of linguistics. I could look at historical linguistics, and we've begun to do that. I told you that 1,000 years ago, Fneozan was perfectly possible. We can look at how language changes over time. Evolutionary linguistics can look at how language develops, that is, how speaker groups actually develop language. Typological linguistics looks across communities to look at differences in structure of language. So it would compare, for example, SVO languages, and it would say, if most of Europe has SVO word order, then why do the Celtic languages have VSO order? And it would seek to explain those differences, seek perhaps to link up with historical linguistics and go back into what we know about historical linguistics to see if we ever had common ancestors. Did those languages have a common ancestor? And the answer is yes, they did. So why did one develop subject order first and the other verb order first? We can look at psycholinguistics, that is language in the mind. So we were talking a little bit about that before. We can look at neurolinguistics, that is neurological responses to language. We can look at language acquisition, how children acquire their first language. And language acquisition also covers how adult speakers acquire second and third and fourth languages. So there are different fields, subfields within the field of language acquisition. We might even want to study the history of linguistics as a discipline. So what have we believed about linguistics across time around the world? So, for example, some of the most prominent scholars that we know who studied language are Indian, and they're from 1,000 years ago. Panini, for example, and his theories of linguistics. Plato's treatises on linguistics. What has been said about linguistics over time? That's a whole subfield. And then the philosophy of language. So how does language link up with what we believe and what we conceptualize the world as? We'll come on to that in a minute. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And you may well encounter some of these different domains in the modules that you choose in the years to come. So within Warwick, we very much cover psycholinguistics, social linguistics, language acquisition, historical linguistics, and there will be opportunities to look at those. What do we do? What do linguists do? Okay, well, a lot of things is the answer, but some of the more perhaps obvious applications of linguistic analysis have to do with clinical linguistics. So in fact, clinical linguistics looks at how sounds are produced in the mouth, and clinical linguistics may end up with us working in speech therapy. Okay, so clinical linguists sometimes find themselves working in speech therapy, helping people who've had strokes, helping people with aphasia, helping people who've had brain surgery, helping children who have issues producing sounds, working with children who are partially deaf. We might go into computational linguistics, so we might actually write programs that help us to use language in an IT context. So, for example, you might go and work for Google Translate. Forensic linguistics. So, in fact, many people now, this is a rising field, as courts begin to take forensic linguistics seriously, it is actually the living of some people to run agencies where they do things like comparing two text messages and saying within a certain degree of accuracy whether we think the text messages were written by the same sender. Or they might look at a voice clip if there's an anonymous call, and they might try and predict where that speaker is from or how old they are or something about their ethnic background. So forensic linguistics is a rising science and a fascinating one. Translation is also an application of linguistic analysis. If we can say a lot about the structures of language, and if we know a lot about pragmatics, then we're probably better translators than we were before. You might be a lexicographer. So lexicographers work on dictionaries. They decide which words should go into the dictionary, which words might be relegated out of use. They decide how to define words. So there are roles for lexicographers round the country, round the world. So there are many, many applications. Right, have a break and think about this particular question. What is the difference between communication and language? I want you to think about whether there is a difference between those two terms. So, in order to think about this differential between communication and language and whether we want to talk about one of those, I'm going to introduce you to the work of Charles Hockett, who was an anthropologist. And he published a very famous paper, which I'm going to link to on Moodle, which you can read for yourself, in which he proposed that there were design features of language. Language had particular features, some of which it shared with communication, and some of which were unique to human language. He talks about duality. That is the notion that we combine phonemes into morphemes to make words, and then we then combine words into strings of utterances to make sentences. So duality, two sorts of patterning. Productivity. Anything we can hear, we can produce. We do have to be able to hear. So, unfortunately, Hockett really didn't take into account at all people who are deaf. He didn't take into account sign language, and we do have to problematize his design features list because it doesn't discuss sign language. But we can come on to sign language, and we find that although sign language presupposes no auditory channel on the part of one or more of the communicators, that is, one or more communicators lacks the ability to hear. Sign language patterns in all other respects, as spoken languages do. So we can adapt Hockett's list. Arbitrariness, that is, there is no connection between the string of sounds and the meaning of a word. Okay, they are arbitrary. If we look at something like cat, it doesn't matter if we call it katse, or cat, or cath in Welsh, or any other name for a cat. It's completely random. We could call it horse as long as we all agreed that the string of phonemes that says horse means a creature with pointy ears and whiskers that says meow. It does not make a difference. It's arbitrary. cover some more of those features. So interchangeability, anything we can hear or see as sign language users, anything we can hear, we can produce. So if we can hear it, we can produce it. Contrast that with productivity, and that productivity is one of the features really that sets language apart from communication, or at least that Hockett has argued sets language apart from communication. That is, there's no limit to the topics that we can talk about. Once we have human language, there is no limit at all. And that's linked a little bit to displacement. Displacement means that we can talk about things that may never happen, that have never happened, that will never happen, that take place in other galaxies, that are distant in time and space from us. So we have this ability to talk about things that haven't happened. Linguists call it irrealis. So some languages have things like the subjunctive. If I were a rich man, if I were an alien, I would have little green horns and say meep meep. So we can talk about things that we've never experienced and that we may never experience. That's displacement. According to Hockett, one of the design features is specialization. That is, sounds are adapted to mean certain things. If a dog pants, that's simply because it's hot. If we say a particular phoneme, it's usually for a particular reason. There's also the issue of cultural transmission. So Hockett, as an anthropologist, would disagree with some linguists. He felt that language was transmitted by culture, so you had to learn within a speech community. And we will come onto that and interrogate it. You have to learn, in order to learn correctly all of your language, you must acquire it from speakers of that language. What else does he propose? He says that we have a vocal auditory channel, that is, in spoken language, that we have to have the loop between someone's voice producing a sound and us hearing that. We might talk about rapid fading. So if you look on the right-hand side, rapid fading means that the speech signal doesn't last. Although we can talk about having voice recorders now, but if we're not there to hear it, or if we're too far away to hear it, that signal won't last. It fades on the breeze. We haven't got it to make constant reference to, as we do in writing. Spoken language fades away. Contrast that with something like an animal marking a tree stump to say, I'm here. That won't fade away so quickly. The kind of very strong urine that some male animals produce to mark scent, and some female animals, in fact, doesn't fade away so quickly, and in fact it can be left for days. Or we might contrast that with animals leaving feces as a kind of sign that they've been somewhere. We can link this also to broadcast transmission and directional reception. So in fact, when we speak, we can turn our heads to project our voice towards someone. They in turn can turn their ears towards us if they wish to. This isn't the same for all animal communication. So think back to my example of scats, weasels leaving a piece of feces on a tree stump. If you don't happen to walk past it, you won't get that message. Okay, you can't move that piece of scat from a tree stump if you're a weasel. It has to stay where it is, so you don't have the ability to communicate with a wider audience. We might also talk about semanticity. So he kept adding to his list of features, actually. And you can see that in 1966 he added more. Okay, but he talks about semanticity. When we talk about semanticity, we're back to my concept of I hit my hot hat. Okay, so the idea that hit and hot and hat are attached to particular semantic reference. Okay, hit is the action of striking, hot is the state of not being cold, and hat is a particular head covering that's used across many cultures. Okay, in 1966, he adds 3 extra features, so we'll look at those as well. Prevarication is interesting, and I want you to think about it in terms of animal communication, actually. It's the idea that we can say something misleading, or in fact we can deliberately lie, so the content of our communication doesn't have to be true. And I want you to think about that, and we will have a discussion in our forum this week about these design features, where we try to come up with examples, and we compare and contrast animal communication and human language. And we'll try to problematize and really interrogate some of Hockett's design features, as well as trying to identify the ones that identify human language as specifically very different. Okay. Reflexiveness is in fact the ability to talk about language, and that's interesting. We can actually comment on someone's accent, or we can comment on the content of what they'd said, or we can reflect on our own language abilities through language, and that is quite crucial. And learnability. So if we have the ability to acquire one language, we have the ability to learn a second. And we might want to think about animals like ravens and parrots, who can acquire other sound systems. Are they really acquiring human language when they mimic us, or are they simply mimicking? Is there any examples? in the animal kingdom of animals acquiring a second set of codes that pertain to another species. Okay? So we'll think about learnability. So don't try and absorb all of these at once. Rather, you can read the paper that I'm going to put on Moodle for you, and then you can take part in a discussion on the forum, and I will kick us off with an example from the animal kingdom that we can discuss, and you may add your own. You can also disagree, so do feel free to find documentary links, to find links to news articles, and to add to Hockett's list of animal behaviours and human behaviours, so that we can really discuss this in some depth, because it's at the heart of the philosophy of language. What is language? What does it mean to have a language as opposed to communicating? So we can see that Hockett, for example, I'll put these up. He talks about herring gulls taking part in caring behaviours for each other. He talks about sticklebacks who perform a particular kind of mating dance. So this is some kind of communication through dance. He also talks about bees doing what's called the waggle dance. So some of you may have seen that there's a beer brewed in Britain called waggle dance. And a waggle dance is something that honeybees perform to tell other bees in the colony how far away a particular food source is and in what direction. And you can look at all of these examples. But you can also come up with more liminal examples that are more troubling to us to try and just rule out as communication. Are they actually evidence of a language? And we want to think about that. Do we have evidence of displacement, that animals can talk about things they've never encountered, never experienced? Do we have evidence, for example, that perhaps animals can lie? Plenty more here, but I won't dwell on these. I'll put them up on the forum. So different accents in birds. Does that mean that the speech communities in birds are different and you must acquire your sound system from the particular community that you grow up in? If we take a sparrow from Newcastle and we take it down to London, will it be able to communicate with other sparrows, or will the accent differences be too great? In terms of Hockett, we can go back to evolutionary linguistics. Okay, that is how language as a system evolved. Why did it evolve as it has evolved? Why has human language evolved the way that it has? Why does it have these particular features? And we can talk about why we might want to develop communication systems. So evolutionary linguistics has a range of different proponents who propose different reasons for why language has evolved as it has. So there's a kind of Darwin linked theory of evolutionary linguistics, that we are in fact competing for resources with other species, and that back before Homo sapiens emerged as the victorious species of human, we were competing with Neanderthal and Australopithecus and other anthropoid people or creatures, whichever way we want to view it, for food and for shelter and for warmth, and this might have influenced the way that our language developed. So we might want to consider that. Is our language developing as a response to our environment, or is it separate from that? Is it perhaps just an addition to our other abilities? So some people view language as simply another behavioural trait. It's like kicking a ball, it's like jumping up and down, it's a trait that we develop as we grow up, but it's not particularly more specialised or any more exciting than those abilities. And we're going to look at things like whether we actually develop language through imitating each other, whether we develop language through imitating phenomena we saw in the natural world, whether language is in fact to some extent symbolic. So if we look at things like onomatopoeia, moo and cock-a-doodle-doo, we can see that actually this business that Hockett talked about of language being completely arbitrary is not strictly true in all cases. We'll also look at phenomena like recursion. That is the idea that all languages around the world can produce an infinite number of clauses in structures like, this is the man that lived in the house that Jack built. Okay, and we can go on and on. This is the cat that killed the rat, that killed the mouse, that drank the milk, that lived in the house that Jack built. By using this relative that, we can sort of make Chinese boxes out of sentences, and we can produce an infinite number of sentences. And some evolutionary linguists hold fast to the hypothesis that there's no language in the world that can't do this because of the nature of human communication, because we might want to talk without ending. We might want to encode information in this way. All human beings will be able to do it, but in fact evidence is emerging that some human languages don't do this. One more warm-up question for you then. You can have a little rest and think about this. How do we learn language? Well, behaviourists like Skinner, and in fact common folk wisdom, suggested back in the 1950s that reward aids people to learn. So, for example, if a child says things like, I doed up my shoes, we would either ignore that child or say, oh, it's not doed, it's did. Okay, and if the child then corrects themselves and says, I did up my shoes, we would say, oh, good, well done, good boy, you said that right this time. But, you know, do they actually get rewarded? Let's problematize that first. If we observe caregivers talking to their children, do they correct them when they make errors that deviate from an adult's L1? We need to see whether that's true or not. Skinner assumed that it was. So this is the danger, really, of rational linguistics, of doing rationalist linguistics, where we reason something out and we think it's so obvious it must be true, let's test it. When we come to test these hypotheses, this notion that parents and caregivers reward their children for correct utterances, we might find that that's not actually true. What are they being rewarded for? Are they being rewarded for finding the correct structure? Are they being rewarded for producing an utterance that that particular parent considers to be appropriate? And what happens if we don't reward them? Behaviourist scientists also propose that children copy their parents, but we know that this is also not particularly true. So we know that, first of all, they do copy their parents. They will say things like, I rode my bicycle. And later on, when they realise that the more common strategy is to put ed on the end in English, they say things like, I rided my bicycle down the street. And they get very cross when caregivers correct them. They also produce novel utterances of their own. So my own daughter was faced with a picture of a fairy and she said, it's a girl fly. So they don't, and she resisted completely the notion that there was a label for this that was fairy. She saw the little girl and she saw the wings and she quite reasonably combined fly and girl to make a compound that she thought made more sense. Parents teach children language, behaviourists say, but actually there are cultures where parents don't really teach children language. Or at least not in the way that we in Western Europe experience being taught language. We're often, for example, bought books. Parents sit and watch television with us. Parents sing to us. There are cultures in which that's not possible. So if you're out farming all day, if you're, for example, in Samoa, and you're busy on the land, you might leave children with their siblings. And the siblings might find the children terribly boring and don't actually do very much active teaching of language. The children still acquire language perfectly fine. We might also want to talk about children creating analogies. Okay, so they might hear things like William is 3 and be able to turn it into a question. They might notice that people move the verb to the front in a question. But what do we do in complex sentences where there's a relative embedded? The girl who was playing is my friend. Which verb should we move? And we do get both structures. We get was the girl who was playing my friend, but we also get is the girl who was playing is my friend. So they will reduplicate, they move, but they leave it there as well. What's going on there? They're not hearing that structure anywhere from the caregivers, but they are, by analogy, producing this. A very famous test to look at how children acquire language was developed by Jean Burko in 1958, and I'm sure you will have seen this little creature before. It's called a wug. So what she did was to give this to children, age 3 and age 4, and to say to them, here is a wug. Now there is another one. There are 2, and they had to fill in the closed test. They had to fill in the bit that was missing, and most children by this stage know that it's wugs. Very few children will say wuggies. Most children won't say wugs, because that's very hard phonotactically. Most children are orienting to it being wugs. The good thing about this is that it's a novel strategy. They've never seen this creature before, and yet they still know how to pluralize it. So they must have learnt something about the phonotactic properties of the plural. They've learnt that after a voiced stop, after g, you tend to get z. Okay? There's a nice video about this that you can watch, so I'll put this link up onto Moodle. So what? Why are we so excited about this? Well, because they tend to know more about language than they could based on the data they observe. So Chomsky talked about the poverty of the stimulus. And what he was meaning wasn't that parents don't talk properly or don't talk to their children. He wasn't making any assumptions about parenting. He was simply remarking that actually the data they get to work with comes out very fast. We often talk in clauses that are highly fragmented. We talk in a very complex way. Sometimes we don't finish sentences. How are they possibly inferring all the structure from this incomplete, unfinished data that they observe? How can they produce utterances that they couldn't have learnt because they've never heard them? So they've never seen a wug. How do they know then that the correct plural is wugs? How are they all moving towards that goal? And Chomsky noticed, and in fact infant language researchers have noticed, that all children in all cultures, speaking all languages, learn at basically the same rates. They progress through the same developmental stages at about the same time. So phonologically they will learn certain sounds first and others they tend to learn later. Morphologically they tend to learn certain structures first and others slightly later on. They can fill in linguistic gaps, so if they're given something like the wug, they can say that it's wugs. And, crucially, and we know this, children who are not exposed to language very early in life sometimes don't ever develop language. Now, we can expand on this, and we will expand on this in the forums. I will post some information about this, because it's crucial, and it links back to what Hockett said about language being socialised, that we have to learn it through socialisation. And to some extent it goes against what Chomsky said, because Chomsky's arguing that they can only do this because there's some specialised language faculty in the brain. They can only acquire language so perfectly, having been given such imperfect sources, because they have an innate predisposition for learning language. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the forums this week as well. What about a biological analogy? So we can think about Eric Lenneberg, who again was working in the 50s, and said that language was a biologically controlled behaviour. In that sense, he says it emerges before it's necessary. It's not conscious, it's not triggered by external events, and we might want to think about this. He noted that direct teaching has little effect. There are milestones which tend to relate to age, so I've just talked about that, and there seems to be a critical period beyond which it is very hard, if not impossible, to become a full speaker of a language. And we're back to the conundrum I set you at the start. What does it mean to know a language? So Lenneberg equated this to biological phenomena. And you can watch this video, which argues quite strongly that people are born with innate language ability. But there are those who disagree, and we will come on to study those. So, during this somewhat lengthy lecture, we have certainly discussed what it means to know a language. I want you to keep thinking about that as you go through your degree. We've described accurately the levels of linguistic analysis you'll be engaging in, and different domains of study, so we looked across the subdomains of linguistics. We've had a look at Hockett's design features, and we're going to do more of that in the forums and then in the seminar. We've talked a little bit about language acquisition and what it means to acquire something naturalistically as an observer in our speech community versus instructional learning. We've refuted some explanations for language learning which are based on Skinner's idea of behaviourism, that we are given a positive reward and then behave in the way that was positively rewarded. And if that's all we've done by the end of this lecture, we've done very well. But we should be starting to think about the following terminology, and we can do this. So we need to think about competence. Competence is the ability to produce language. Performance is the actual production of language itself, which is full of flaws. So you think about how I've given this lecture. I got a bit nervous, I've tripped over my words, I've forgotten a couple of terms from Hockett's design features, I've had to go and look at those and tell you what they are. I will have slowed down a little bit while I was doing that. I've probably said a few phonemes wrong, I've inserted a few words I didn't mean to, I've explained a couple of things wrongly and had to correct myself. That's performance. We need to think about acquisition, what it is to acquire a language. How do we acquire it? Naturalistically, from the speech community, or instructionally? And we can start to think about the grammar of a language, the rules surrounding the syntax of a language. And we can start to think about differences across languages in the world. Do they all, for example, have the category of noun and verb? Do they all contain recursion? Can we do this Chinese box recursion, referring to concepts within concepts across all languages in the world? And I will post you a nice article about that to start you off. So a nice broad lecture to start us off, with plenty of activities to be taking part in. And we've really made a good start on introducing what it is to be a linguist, the different paths we might go down once we've finished our degree, and how linguistics can help us in real-world situations. Thank you for listening.